Have you ever entered a room and felt judged before even speaking? Imagine arriving at an important business meeting only to be treated as if you didn't belong. This is exactly what happens to David, a talented business strategist who's about to reveal something that no one in the room expects. What's he hiding, and how will it change the lives of everyone involved? Get ready for a stunning revelation. David adjusted his navy blazer one last time before stepping into the boardroom. His leather shoes gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting his meticulousness. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the documents in his briefcase, papers that could transform the direction of this company. But before he could present them, he had to overcome something that shouldn't exist in 2024: discrimination. When he opened the door, the chatter in the room died down. The senior executives at the global headquarters of MaxTech Solutions in Toronto glanced at him with disinterest. No one acknowledged his presence, let alone stood up to greet him. Thomas, the current managing director, frowned slightly before returning to the paperwork spread across the table, treating David as though he were an outsider. "Excuse me," David said politely. "I'm here for the executive strategy meeting." Sophia, the CFO, barely looked up. "The refreshments go over there," she said, gesturing toward the corner of the room. David's stomach turned, but this wasn't the first time he'd encountered such treatment. Still, it stung. "Actually, Listen," interrupted Marcus, the head of marketing, with a dismissive wave. "We're in the middle of something important. Please be quick." David bit his tongue and made his way to a chair at the back of the room, unnoticed as the executives resumed their conversation, oblivious to his presence. Thomas began the meeting. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to discuss the future of MaxTech Solutions. The last 2 quarters have been disappointing, and we need innovative ideas to get back on track." David listened intently, silently making notes. His mind raced with ideas that could not only help the company recover, but transform it into a leader in the tech industry. But each time he attempted to join the conversation, someone interrupted or simply talked over him. "We need to cut costs," Sophia suggested, scanning a spreadsheet on her tablet. "I recommend downsizing our R&D budget. It's bleeding too much money." David finally saw his opening. "I'd suggest the opposite," he said. "We should be investing more in research and development if we want to innovate and stay competitive." Marcus smirked. "With all due respect, who are you again? We didn't invite any outside consultants." David's face burned. He was about to introduce himself properly when Thomas swiftly cut him off. "Moving on," the managing director said, dismissing David's comment without a second thought. "We also need fresh leadership, someone with a strong vision for the future of this company." The irony wasn't lost on David. He knew he was exactly the person they needed, but their assumptions had blinded them to that fact. The meeting dragged on, with David watching as poor decisions were made, based on nothing more than the same stale ideas that had gotten them into trouble in the first place. Finally, when the subject of their upcoming global expansion came up, David couldn't remain silent any longer. "We might need to reconsider the timing of our expansion into the European market," said Evelyn, the director of operations. "Maybe push it back to next year." David stood up. His pulse raced, but he maintained his composure. Straightening his jacket, he walked confidently to the head of the table. The room fell silent, and the senior executives turned to him, confused by his sudden assertiveness. "If I may," David began, "I think I have something important to contribute regarding the company's future." The executives exchanged puzzled and irritated looks. Thomas leaned back in his chair, visibly uncomfortable. Look, I don't know who you think you are, but David smiled, a sad yet resolute smile. That's what we need to address, Thomas. Who I am, and what that means for this company. The tension in the room was palpable. No one moved, no one spoke. For the first time that day, all eyes were on David. Ladies and gentlemen, he continued, I think it's time for a brief recess. There's something you all need to know. Something that will change the direction of this meeting and the future of MaxTech Solutions. Silence followed. David stood tall, exuding confidence, while the rest of the room sat in confused frustration. Thomas finally spoke up. We don't have time for this. You should have made time for it from the beginning, David said, cutting him off. But no one cared to ask. Sophia scoffed. And why should we? You're just a... David interrupted, his voice steady but firm. A highly qualified strategist with years of experience in innovation and leadership. Yes, that's exactly what I am. The room was silent again, now filled with a sense of unease. Marcus shifted nervously in his seat. Look, he began, trying to salvage the situation. Why don't we all introduce ourselves and David shook his head. Your judgment wasn't based on who I am, but on what you assumed when I walked through that door. You judged me by appearance, not by my knowledge or experience. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Evelyn, trying to remain professional, spoke up. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. David, he replied calmly. David Esparza. Evelyn's eyes widened in recognition. Wait, David Esparza? As in the David Esparza who... David nodded. Yes, the same. But before we continue, I have one question. For the past hour, you've been debating the company's future, yes? You never once considered that the person you've been ignoring might have the solutions you're looking for. Thomas stood, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. This is enough. What kind of game are you playing? David's voice grew stronger. This isn't a game, Thomas. It's reality. While you talked about needing fresh leadership, I was here, quietly listening to every misguided decision. Sure, David began pacing around the table, making eye contact with each executive. You're talking about slashing the R&D budget when you should be doubling down on it. You're thinking about delaying international expansion when now is exactly the time to push forward. Sophia, trying to regain composure, asked, How do you know this for certain? David gave her a small, knowing smile. Because, Sophia, I've spent the last 6 months studying every detail of this company, its numbers, its people, its strategies. I know its strengths and weaknesses better than anyone in this room. Marcus, now clearly agitated, leaned forward. Why would you even do that? Who are you really? David stopped, facing the table. I am the person the board selected to take MaxTech Solutions into the future. I am the new managing director. The shock was immediate. Thomas stumbled, grasping the table for support. Sophia dropped her stylus, while Marcus and Evelyn exchanged disbelieving glances. That can't be right, Thomas stammered. No one told me about this. David calmly pulled a folder from his briefcase, the same briefcase he had placed aside when he entered the room. He handed the folder to Evelyn, who was sitting closest. This is the official notification from the board. My appointment takes effect next Monday. As the document made its way around the table, David continued, The board asked me to observe the team today, to evaluate how it operates and where improvements are needed. They didn't ask me to remain silent. That was my decision. Evelyn, after reading the document, looked at David with a mix of awe and regret. "Why didn't you say something from the start?" David sighed. "Because, Evelyn, sometimes the best way to understand a problem is to experience it firsthand. Today, unfortunately, I saw a significant problem in this company. Prejudice." The room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. The executives sat in stunned silence, reflecting on the last hour's events. "I could have introduced myself as the new managing director from the moment I walked in," David said, "and you would have treated me with respect, but it would have been respect based on my title, not on who I am as a person. That's exactly what needs to change." Carlos, still visibly shaken, tried to compose himself. "David, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything now, Thomas," David replied, his voice softer. "Instead, I want all of you to reflect. Reflect on how you treat people, not just those you think are important, but all people. Because true leadership, true innovation, can come from anywhere, from anyone." David then walked to the head of the table, the spot traditionally reserved for the CEO. He didn't sit, but rested his hands on the chair, looking at each of the executives. "Starting Monday, we will begin a new era in this company, an era of mutual respect, of valuing diversity, of true innovation. But to do that, we must first recognize and correct our mistakes." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Now, I'd like to propose something different for the rest of this meeting. Instead of talking about cuts and delays, how about we discuss how we can create a truly inclusive corporate culture? How can we ensure that talent is recognized regardless of appearance or background?" The executives looked at each other, a mixture of shame, regret, and surprisingly, a spark of hope in their eyes. David observed the reactions, knowing that the real challenge was just beginning. The transformation he intended to initiate went far beyond business strategies. It was a fundamental shift in the company's mindset and culture. "So," David said, his voice now filled with determination and a touch of challenge, "who wants to start?" The silence that followed David's question was heavy, laden with conflicting emotions. The executives glanced at each other, none wanting to be the first to speak. It was Sophia who finally broke the silence, her voice trembling slightly. I'd like to start by apologizing, David. My behavior was unacceptable." David nodded, his face serious but not hostile. "Thank you, Sophia. Acknowledging the mistake is the first step. But what can we do to change?" Marcus cleared his throat nervously, adjusting his tie. Maybe we could implement a diversity and inclusion training program for all employees, starting with leadership." "Good idea, Marcus," David replied. "But don't you think we need to go beyond just training?" Evelyn, who had been quiet until then, raised her hand timidly. "What if we reviewed our hiring and promotion policies? Make sure we're truly giving equal opportunities to everyone." David smiled, genuinely impressed. "Excellent suggestion, Evelyn. That could make a big difference." Thomas, still visibly shaken, finally spoke. "David, I don't know what to say. As CEO, I should have set the example. Instead, I was part of the problem." David approached Thomas, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Thomas, we all make mistakes. What's important is how we react to them and what we do to correct them." At that moment, the meeting room door abruptly opened. An elegant, middle-aged woman entered with firm steps. It was Helena Rodriguez, the chairwoman of the board. "Sorry for the delay," she said, her eyes scanning the room and noting the tense atmosphere. "It seems I arrived at an interesting moment." David turned to her, surprised. "Mrs. Rodriguez, we weren't expecting your presence today." Helena smiled enigmatically. "Well, David, I thought it would be important to be here to see how things would unfold, and from what I can see, it was a revealing meeting." The executives fidgeted uncomfortably in their seats. Helena continued, her voice firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, when the board decided to bring David as the new managing director, we knew we were making a bold choice, not just because of his impressive qualifications, but because of what he represents, a necessary change in our corporate culture." She walked over to stand beside David. "What happened here today was no accident. It was a test that, unfortunately, you failed miserably." Thomas stood up, his face pale. "Helena, I can explain." Helena raised her hand, silencing him. "There's no need, Thomas. Your actions, or rather, the lack thereof, spoke louder than any explanation could." She turned to the group. "What you don't know is that this meeting was recorded, not just to document the business decisions, but to capture how you would treat someone who doesn't fit the traditional mold of an executive." The shock was visible on everyone's faces. Sophia let out a small gasp, while Marcus covered his face with his hands. David, surprised by the revelation, looked at Helena with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I didn't know about the recording," David said. Helena smiled at him. "I know, David. We wanted a genuine reaction from both sides, and I must say, you exceeded our expectations. Your patience, professionalism, and ability to lead, even in the face of adversity, are exactly what this company needs." She then turned to the other executives, her gaze hard. "As for you, the consequences of your actions will be discussed in a subsequent board meeting. For now, I suggest you deeply reflect on what happened here today." The atmosphere in the room was one of desolation. Thomas looked as if he'd aged years in a matter of minutes. Sophia struggled to hold back tears, while Marcus and Evelyn seemed to want to disappear into their chairs. David, sensing the gravity of the situation, decided to intervene. "Mrs. Rodriguez, if I may, I'd like to make a suggestion." Helena nodded, curious. "Go ahead, David." "While the behavior demonstrated today is unacceptable, I believe we have a unique opportunity here. Instead of simply punishing, we could use this experience as a starting point for real change." He looked at each of the executives. "You made a mistake, yes, but now you have the chance to do the right thing, to be part of the solution, not the problem." Helena seemed intrigued. "What exactly are you suggesting, David?" "An intensive re-education and awareness program," David replied. "Not just for these executives, but for the entire company. Workshops, lectures, immersive experiences that put people in situations of diversity and inclusion. And most importantly, a real and measurable commitment to change." He turned to the others. "Are you willing to do that? To really make an effort to change, not just for your jobs, but because it's the right thing to do?" The silence that followed was broken by Evelyn. "I am. I want to learn. I want to be better." One by one, the other executives agreed, their voices a mix of regret and determination. Helena observed everything with a calculating look. Finally, she smiled. "David, you've just demonstrated why you were the right choice to lead this company. Your ability to turn a moment of crisis into an opportunity for growth is admirable." She addressed the group. "Very well, let's follow David's plan. But be warned, this is your last chance. Any slip, any sign that you're not taking this seriously, and the consequences will be severe." David nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges, and potential setbacks. But looking at the faces around him, he saw something that gave him hope, the beginning of real change. "Well," he said, his voice full of determination, "we have a lot of work ahead of us. Let's get started."